3, and 6,000 Scottish warriors are standing on top of a hill, looking down at a smaller English force. They have the high ground, they have the numbers, and they're absolutely certain they're about to crush the English army below them. Just 29 years earlier, at a place called Bannockburn, the Scots had humiliated the English in one of the most devastating defeats England had ever suffered. Now, standing on Halidon Hill, the Scottish commanders are confident that history is about to repeat itself. But what these warriors don't know, what they cannot possibly imagine as they prepare to charge down that slope, is that they're about to walk into one of the most catastrophic military disasters in Scottish history. In just a few hours, thousands of them will be dead, their bodies piled so high that chroniclers will struggle to count them. Their king will flee for his life, and Scotland's independence will hang by a thread. This is the story of how English archers turned a Scottish advantage into a bloodbath, and how one battle changed the way wars would be fought for the next 100 years. Before we dive into the carnage at Halidon Hill, we need to understand how Scotland and England ended up in this situation in the first place. See, the relationship between these two kingdoms had always been complicated, but things really went sideways in the late 1200s. England's King Edward I, a man whose nickname was literally the Hammer of the Scots, had spent years trying to conquer Scotland. He came pretty close too, but the Scots were tough, resilient, and absolutely refused to stay conquered. Leaders like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce turned resistance into an art form. Then came Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce didn't just defeat the English, he absolutely demolished them. King Edward II, son of the Hammer of the Scots, led a massive army into Scotland, and Bruce trapped them near Stirling and cut them to pieces. It was humiliating for England, and it secured Scottish independence for a generation. Fast forward to 1328, and Robert the Bruce is still King of Scotland, now internationally recognized after years of diplomatic maneuvering. The English have finally, grudgingly, acknowledged Scottish independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. For the Scots, this is their golden age. But here's the thing about golden ages: they never last as long as you want them to. Robert the Bruce dies in 1329, and his son, David II, becomes king. Now, David is only 5 years old. 5. You can't exactly have a kindergartner running a country, especially one that's surrounded by enemies. So Scotland is now being run by regents, powerful nobles who are supposed to govern until David grows up. Meanwhile, in England, something interesting is happening. Edward II, the king who lost so badly at Bannockburn, has been deposed and very likely murdered. His son, Edward III, takes the throne in 1327 when he's just 14 years old. Now, young Edward has grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, Edward I, the great warrior king who nearly conquered Scotland. He's also grown up with the shame of his father's defeat at Bannockburn hanging over the family name like a dark cloud. Edward III is ambitious, he's proud, and he's absolutely determined to restore English prestige and wash away the stain of Bannockburn. He's looking for an opportunity, and Scotland is about to hand him one on a silver platter. Enter Edward Balliol. Now this guy's father, John Balliol, had briefly been King of Scotland back in the 1290s, before Robert the Bruce's family took over. The Balliols never forgot that they once wore the crown, and Edward Balliol thinks he has a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne. He's living in exile in England, and he's got friends, powerful English nobles, who see supporting Balliol as a way to destabilize Scotland and maybe even bring it under English control. In 1332, Balliol invades Scotland with English backing. The Scottish forces, still thinking they're invincible after Bannockburn, meet Balliol's army at a place called Duplin Moor. And this is where things start to go very, very wrong for Scotland. At Duplin Moor, the Scots have superior numbers. They should win. But Balliol's forces, which include a lot of English knights and archers, use tactics that the Scots haven't really encountered before. The English archers rain arrows down on the Scottish formations, causing chaos and casualties before the two sides even meet in close combat. The Scots try to push forward in their traditional dense formations, these massive blocks of men wielding spears and pikes, but they're taking devastating losses from the arrows. By the time they actually reach the English lines, they're disorganized, they've lost momentum, and they're getting butchered. The Battle of Duplin Moor is a disaster for Scotland, thousands die, and Edward Balliol manages to get himself crowned King of Scotland. Sure, he only controls a tiny portion of the country, and most Scots don't recognize him, but he's got the crown, and more importantly, he's got English support. The Scots aren't about to let this stand. They rally, they counterattack, and they actually manage to drive Balliol out of Scotland by the end of 1332. He flees back to England with his tail between his legs. But now Edward III has his excuse. Balliol appeals to him for help, and Edward sees his opportunity. He's going to invade Scotland, put his puppet king back on the throne, and in the process show everyone that England is back, that the humiliation of Bannockburn is over. In March of 1333, Edward III leads an army north and lays siege to the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. Now Berwick is important. It's a wealthy port town on the border between England and Scotland, and it's been going back and forth between the two kingdoms for decades. At this moment, it's in Scottish hands, and Edward wants it. He surrounds the town with his army and starts the siege. The Scots have to respond. If Berwick falls, it's a huge symbolic and strategic loss. The Scottish regents, led by Archibald Douglas, the Guardian of Scotland, gather an army and march south to lift the siege. Their plan is actually pretty clever. Instead of directly attacking Edward's well-prepared siege lines around Berwick, they're going to invade northern England, raid and burn English territory, and force Edward to abandon the siege to defend his own lands. It's the same kind of asymmetric warfare that had worked so well for Robert the Bruce. But Edward III doesn't take the bait. He keeps his army at Berwick and sends word to the Scots that if they want to save the town, they're going to have to come fight him. He's calling their bluff, and it works. The defenders of Berwick are running out of supplies, and they negotiate a deal. If a Scottish relief force doesn't defeat the English and lift the siege by a certain date in July, they'll surrender the town. Now the Scots have no choice. They have to fight. Archibald Douglas gathers his forces and marches to Berwick. By mid-July 1333, a Scottish army estimated at somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 men, sources vary, is approaching the area. Edward has positioned his forces on Halidon Hill, about 2 miles northwest of Berwick, and this is where Edward shows that he's learned from English mistakes and from English successes. See, the English had been experimenting with using masses of archers as a primary offensive weapon, not just a supporting element. At Duplin Moor, it had worked brilliantly. Edward III has studied this, and he's about to take it to the next level. On the morning of July 19, 1333, the two armies face each other. The Scots are in a tough position. They need to attack because time is running out for Berwick, but Edward has chosen his ground carefully. Halidon Hill isn't a massive mountain, but it's high enough to give a solid defensive advantage. The English are positioned on top of the hill in a formation that's going to become iconic in medieval warfare. Edward has divided his army into 3 divisions, or battles as they were called, and he's positioned them in a line along the crest of the hill. Each division has dismounted men-at-arms in the centre, the heavily armoured knights and nob. Les, who would normally fight on horseback, have gotten off their horses and formed a solid defensive corps. This is important. By dismounting, they're showing they're not going to retreat, they're going to stand and fight, but more than that, they're creating a stable, immovable wall. On the flanks of each division, Edward has placed massive formations of archers. These are English and Welsh longbowmen, and they're about to change everything. The longbow is a devastating weapon in the right hands. It's about 6 feet tall, made from yew wood, and it requires incredible strength and years of practice to use effectively. An experienced longbowman can shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute, and those arrows can pierce armor at close range and kill or maim at longer distances. Edward has thousands of these archers, and he's positioned them so they can create overlapping fields of fire. The setup is brilliant. Any force trying to attack the English positions will have to advance across open ground through a marsh at the bottom of the hill and then up the slope, all while being shot at from multiple angles. The Scots look at this situation and they have to know it's bad. But they don't really have a choice. Berwick is going to fall if they don't do something, and besides, they have the numbers, they have the courage, and they have the memory of Bannockburn, where Scottish infantry demolished English cavalry. The Scottish commanders think that if they can just get their men across that killing ground and up the hill, they can smash into the English lines and break them. It's not a crazy plan. Scottish schiltrons, those dense formations of spearmen, had proven effective before. The problem is, they've never faced anything quite like what's waiting for them on Halidon Hill. The Scottish army begins its advance. Thousands of men, organized into their own divisions of schiltrons, start moving toward the English position. They have to cross rough ground, and there's a marshy area at the base of Halidon Hill that they need to get through. This immediately starts to break up their formations. Dense blocks of men trying to move through a swamp don't stay dense and organized for long. Men are slipping, formations are getting stretched out, and they haven't even come under fire yet. Then, as they emerge from the marsh and start up the slope, the arrows begin to fall. Imagine you're a Scottish soldier in one of these schiltrons. You're packed in tight with hundreds or thousands of other men, all of you carrying long spears, wearing whatever armor you could afford, which for most men isn't much. You've just struggled through a marsh, you're wet and tired, and now you're trying to run uphill in formation. Then you hear it, a sound like wind or thunder, but it's not weather, it's thousands of arrows being launched simultaneously. The sky darkens with arrows. They come down in waves, and there's nowhere to hide. You're in a tight formation, which is great for combat when you reach the enemy. But it's terrible when you're being shot at because you can't dodge. You can't take cover. You're just a target in a mass of targets. The arrows punch through leather, through quilted armor, through chain mail if the angle and force are right. Men start dropping. Someone next to you takes an arrow through the throat and goes down choking on his own blood. Someone else gets hit in the leg and falls, and then gets trampled by the men behind who are still trying to push forward. The noise is unbelievable. Men screaming, officers shouting orders that can't be heard, the constant whistle and thud of arrows hitting shields, armor, flesh and ground. But the Scots are brave, and they push on. They've trained for this kind of warfare. They know that the only way through an arrow storm is to get to the archers and make them stop shooting, which means getting up that hill as fast as possible. But it's not fast at all, because they're going uphill, they're in heavy formations, and they're constantly losing men to the arrows. The English archers aren't just shooting randomly, they're experienced. They're aiming for the densest parts of the Scottish formations, where every arrow is almost guaranteed to hit someone. Some archers are specifically targeting officers and nobles, recognizable by their better armor and banners. Taking out leaders creates chaos in the formations. As the Scots get closer to the English lines, the arrow fire becomes even more devastating. Because now it's not just falling from above, it's coming at them nearly horizontally with incredible force. Arrows fired at close range from a longbow can go completely through a man and hit the person behind him. The Scottish formations are being shredded. Men are pushing forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades, and still the arrows keep coming. By the time any Scottish schiltron actually reaches the English line, it's been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. It's lost all momentum from climbing the hill while being shot at, and the men are exhausted, demoralized, and dying. When the surviving Scots finally crash into the English men-at-arms, they're in no condition to fight effectively. The English, who have been standing in position, rested and ready, with their dismounted knights forming a solid wall of armor and weapons, repel the attacks relatively easily. The Scots try to break through. They fight with desperate courage, but they're outnumbered now after the horrific casualties from the arrows. They're tired, and they're fighting uphill against fresh troops. The English line holds. Then it pushes forward. The men-at-arms begin to advance, and the archers, who have done most of the killing from range, now drop their bows and draw their swords and daggers and join in the close quarters slaughter. What follows is less a battle and more a massacre. The Scottish formations, already battered and broken, start to disintegrate. Individuals and small groups try to flee, but running away from a medieval battle is often more dangerous than fighting. The English cavalry, which Edward had kept in reserve, now charges into the fleeing Scots, cutting them down as they run. There's no organized retreat, it's just panic and death. Scottish soldiers are hunted across the battlefield and into the surrounding countryside. The slaughter goes on for hours. Chronicles from the time struggle to give exact numbers, but they all agree it was catastrophic. Estimates of Scottish dead range from 4,000 to over 10,000. Among the dead is Archibald Douglas himself, the guardian of Scotland and the commander of the army. 5 Scottish earls die at Halidon Hill, along with dozens of other nobles and knights. It's a decapitation of Scottish leadership. English casualties, by contrast, are minimal. Some sources claim only a handful of English soldiers died, maybe a dozen or so. Even if that's an exaggeration and the real number is higher, it's still nothing compared to the Scottish losses. This is one of the most lopsided victories in medieval warfare. The Battle of Halidon Hill lasts only a few hours, but its consequences echo for decades. Berwick surrenders as promised, and Edward III takes control of one of Scotland's most important towns. Edward Balliol is restored to the Scottish throne, though his authority is limited and contested. Young King David II, the legitimate king in the eyes of most Scots, flees to France for safety. Scotland descends into chaos. With so many leaders dead, there's no clear authority to organize resistance against the English occupation. But here's the thing. As devastating as Halidon Hill is for Scotland, it's also a turning point in military history. Edward III has just demonstrated that a well-positioned force of archers, combined with dismounted men-at-arms, can absolutely annihilate a numerically superior enemy. This isn't a fluke, it's a system, a tactic that can be repeated. And Edward is going to repeat it over and over again in France during the 100 Years' War. The battles of Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415 all follow the same basic pattern established at Halidon Hill. English longbowmen in prepared positions, protected by dismounted men-at-arms, creating killing fields that enemy forces have to cross. It works every single time. Halidon Hill also marks the end of Scottish military dominance over England. For a generation after Bannockburn, the Scots had the psychological edge. They'd proven they could beat the English, and the English feared fighting them. After Halidon Hill, that's reversed. The English have avenged Bannockburn and then some. The tactics that worked so well for Robert the Bruce, using terrain, surprise, and the flexibility of schiltron formations, don't work against massed archery in prepared positions. The Scots will continue to fight for their independence, and they'll eventually succeed in maintaining it, but they'll never again have the same kind of crushing battlefield victory over England that they had at Bannockburn. There's also a broader lesson here about military innovation and adaptation. The Scots, in 1333, were still fighting essentially the same way they had fought in 1314 at Bannockburn because it had worked. Why change a winning strategy? But warfare doesn't stand still. The English learned from their defeats, they experimented, they adapted, and they developed a new system that rendered the old Scottish tactics obsolete. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. What works brilliantly in one era becomes a death trap in the next if you don't adapt. The Scots at Halidon Hill were brave, they were experienced, they were fighting for their homeland, but they were using yesterday's tactics against tomorrow's warfare, and it cost them everything. It's worth thinking about what it must have been like to be a Scottish soldier who survived Halidon Hill. You've just watched thousands of your countrymen die in a matter of hours. You've seen your leaders killed, your army destroyed, and your kingdom's independence threatened. You somehow made it out alive, but you're traumatized, possibly wounded, and you have to go home and explain what happened. How do you process that kind of defeat? How does a nation process it? For Scotland, Halidon Hill is a wound that takes generations to heal. The immediate aftermath is political chaos and continued English occupation, but over the long term, it forces Scottish military thinkers to reconsider their approach to warfare. For Edward III, Halidon Hill is his coming-out party as a military commander. He's not even 20 years old at the time of the battle, but he's already showing the strategic thinking and tactical innovation that will define his reign. He's learned that you don't need to match your enemy man for man if you can choose your battlefield and use your advantages wisely. The Longbowmen are England's advantage, and Edward exploits that advantage ruthlessly. He'll spend the next several years consolidating English control over southern Scotland, though complete conquest remains elusive. The Scots are too stubborn, the terrain is too difficult, and resistance, while no longer able to win major battles, can still make occupation costly and frustrating. By 1336, David II is still in exile in France, and Scotland is effectively partitioned between territories controlled by Balliol and Edward on one side, and Scottish loyalists on the other. It's a messy situation that will continue for years. Eventually, David returns from exile in 1341 and reclaims his throne, but by then Edward III is deeply involved in the 100 Years' War with France and doesn't have the resources to maintain a full occupation of Scotland. The Anglo-Scottish wars continue in fits and starts for decades, but they never again reach the intensity of the 1330s. What makes Halidon Hill so fascinating from a historical perspective is that it's a perfect case study in how battles are won and lost. The Scots had several factors in their favour. They had numbers, they had experience, they had motivation, but they made critical mistakes. They allowed themselves to be forced into a battle on unfavourable terms because of the time pressure from Berwick's surrender deadline. They attacked a prepared defensive position uphill without adequate reconnaissance of what they were facing. They used tactics that had worked before without considering how the English might have adapted. The English, on the other hand, did everything right. Edward chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. He remained disciplined and didn't take the bait when the Scots tried to lure him away from Berwick, and he executed his battle plan flawlessly. There's also something deeply human about the story of Halidon Hill. These aren't just faceless armies clashing, they're thousands of individuals, each with their own story, their own reasons for being there, their own fears and hopes. The Scottish soldier who left his farm to defend his country and never came home. The English archer who practiced with his bow since childhood and now uses it to kill men he's never met. The young king, Edward III, trying to live up to his grandfather's legacy and prove he's not his father. The Scottish nobles who died leading their men from the front, which was expected of medieval commanders. All of these individual stories combine into the larger narrative of the battle, and that battle in turn becomes part of the even larger story of two nations struggling for dominance and survival. When we look back at Halidon Hill from the perspective of nearly 700 years later, it's easy to see it as just one more medieval battle, one more slaughter in an age full of them. But at the time it was world-shaking. It redrew the political map of Britain. It changed the course of military development, and it determined the fates of thousands of people. The echoes of Halidon Hill can be found in every subsequent major battle involving English longbowmen. When Henry V stands before the gates of Harfleur and later triumphs at Agincourt, he's using lessons learned at Halidon Hill. When military historians talk about the supremacy of the longbow in medieval warfare, Halidon Hill is one of the key battles that established that supremacy. It's also a reminder of how quickly fortunes can change in war. Just 19 years before Halidon Hill, at Bannockburn, the Scots had seemed invincible. Now, after a single afternoon of combat, their army is destroyed and their kingdom is on the brink of collapse. The wheel of fortune, a common medieval metaphor, has turned completely. This is one reason why medieval people were often fatalistic about warfare and politics. They understood that everything could change in a moment, that victory could turn to defeat, that life could turn to death with shocking speed. Halidon Hill exemplifies this brutal reality. Looking at the broader context of the 100 Years' War, which is just beginning at this time, Halidon Hill can be seen as the opening act. Edward III is testing strategies against the Scots that he'll later use against the French. He's training an army, developing tactics, and building confidence. When he turns his attention to France and claims the French throne for himself, starting the 100 Years' War, he'll bring all these lessons with him. The great English victories of that war, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, are all variations on the theme first perfected at Halidon Hill. Position your army defensively, use your archers to devastate attacking forces, and let the enemy come to you and die trying to reach your lines. The French will suffer the same fate as the Scots, charging into arrow storms that tear their armies apart. They'll learn eventually and they'll adapt their tactics, which is part of why the 100 Years' War lasts so long and swings back and forth. But in 1333, standing on Halidon Hill with the Scottish dead piled around them, the English have discovered a winning formula that will serve them well for over a century. It's hard to overstate how significant this is. We're talking about a tactical innovation that gives England a relatively small kingdom the ability to defeat much larger enemies consistently. This isn't just winning battles, it's winning battles in a way that seems almost unfair, where the casualty ratios are so lopsided that it borders on the absurd. Of course, there are limits to this system. It requires the right terrain. It requires the enemy to be foolish enough or desperate enough to attack your prepared positions, and it requires highly trained longbowmen, which England has in abundance because of laws requiring regular archery practice, but which other kingdoms can't easily replicate. When enemies refuse to play along, when they avoid pitched battles and use guerrilla tactics or siege warfare, the English longbow is much less decisive. This is part of why England never fully conquers Scotland or France, despite its battlefield successes. Winning battles doesn't automatically translate to winning wars, especially when you're trying to occupy hostile territory. But on that day in July of 1333, none of these long-term considerations matter to the men fighting and dying on Halidon Hill. For the Scots, it's a day of unimaginable horror and loss. For the English, it's a day of triumph and vindication. For Edward III, it's the moment he establishes himself as a warrior king worthy of his grandfather's legacy. And for military history, it's a case study that will be analyzed for centuries, an example of how technology, tactics, and terrain can combine to produce a decisive victory. So when we remember the Battle of Halidon Hill, we should remember it not just as a Scottish defeat or an English victory, but as a turning point, a moment when warfare changed, when old certainties were shattered, and when thousands of men died to teach lessons that would shape conflicts for generations to come. The Scottish warriors who marched confidently toward Halidon Hill that morning, certain in their cause and their courage, could not have known that they were walking into a slaughter that would haunt their nation's memory. They fought with honor, they died with courage, but they were on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of military evolution, and the wrong side of a hill covered with English archers. That's the brutal reality of Halidon Hill, and that's why, nearly 7 centuries later, we're still talking about it.